We have to cancel tomorrow. Courtney is devastated about the Sephora deal falling through. We need to hold space for her grief right now. Please understand. That was the text my mother sent me at 11:51 p.m. Less than 24 hours before my 18th birthday party. A party I had paid for myself. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stood by the window and watched the catering van which I had booked 6 months ago pull out of the driveway. That was the moment the daughter they knew died. And the architect of their destruction was born. Before we get into the fallout, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. Have you ever had a big moment stolen by someone else's drama? I'd love to hear your story. To understand why I burned it all down, you have to understand the architecture of my family. We lived in Buckhead, Atlanta, in a house that looked like a wedding cake and felt like a museum. My parents, Jeffrey and Cynthia, didn't raise children, they curated assets. My sister Courtney, 26, was the show pony. She was an influencer with bot followers and a personality that required high-speed internet to function. I was Morgan, I was 20, and I was the shadow manager. I didn't just live there. I ran the operation. Since I was 14, I was the one who balanced the household budget because my father couldn't figure out Excel. I was the one who ghostwrote Courtney's college admission essays because she couldn't spell empathy without spell check. I managed my mother's social calendar, my father's medication schedule, and the damage control every time Courtney tweeted something offensive. The pay gap was laughable. Courtney received a monthly allowance of $6,500 to maintain her image. I received zero. I worked nights as a virtual assistant just to pay for my AP textbooks. When I asked for help with tuition, my father told me that struggle builds character. When Courtney wanted imported Italian furniture for her bedroom renovation, $18,000 worth, my mother called it an investment in her personal brand. You might wonder why I stayed. Why I cleaned up their messes for 2 decades without screaming. For a long time, I thought I was just being a good daughter. But looking back, I realize it wasn't loyalty. It was survival. It is what psychologists call the fawn response. When you are raised in a house where love is conditional, you learn that your only value is your utility. I believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just fixed enough problems, if I just made myself indispensable, they would finally see me. I thought my labor was the rent I had to pay just to exist in their world. I was bound by an invisible chain, convinced that leaving them would mean I was nothing. I didn't realize that I wasn't the one who needed them. They were the ones who needed me. I was the load-bearing wall in a house of cards. So when I graduated valedictorian, I didn't ask them for a party. I planned it myself. I saved every penny. I invited the few friends I had, my teachers, the people who actually saw me. It was supposed to be my one day. The one day I wasn't the fixer. And then came the text. Courtney lost a brand deal, something minor, a hair vitamin sponsorship worth maybe $2,000, and suddenly my milestone was collateral damage. They weren't canceling a party. They were confirming a truth I had tried to ignore for 20 years. I didn't matter. My feelings were an inconvenience. My achievements were invisible. And my compliance, that was over. The morning of my birthday, the house was quiet. My parents had taken Courtney to a spa retreat an hour away to help her process her trauma. They left me a generic card on the counter with a $50 bill inside. No note. Just the cash, like a tip for good service. I stared at it for a moment, then added it to my stack. I didn't cry. I didn't scream into a pillow. I moved with surgical precision. I had spent the last 6 months secretly moving my most precious belongings into a storage unit just in case. Now I finished the job. I packed my clothes, my laptop, my diplomas, and the few sentimental items I had managed to keep hidden from Courtney's envy. I wiped my laptop, removing all the family budget spreadsheets, the password lists, and the contact databases I had built for my mother's social club. I left the house key on the kitchen counter right next to a single sheet of paper. On it, I had written a list of every password I had changed that morning: banking, email, social media, utilities, and at the bottom, I wrote one sentence. I am resigning from the position of daughter. I walked out the front door, locked it behind me, and got into my car. As I drove away from the manicured lawns of Buckhead, I didn't look back. I felt lighter, like gravity had suddenly released its hold on me. I drove straight to a studio apartment I had leased 3 weeks ago under a different name, a contingency plan I had hoped I wouldn't need. But as I unlocked the door to my empty, quiet space, I realized I didn't just need it. I deserved it. I wasn't running away. I was finally arriving. The first week, my phone was silent. I suspect they were waiting for me to crawl back. In the narrative they had constructed, I was the ungrateful child. Throwing a tantrum and hunger or loneliness would eventually drive me home. They expected me to fail because they had never bothered to notice that I was the only one succeeding. They gave it 7 days. Then the ecosystem I had maintained for 6 years began to suffer system failure. It started small. The Wi-Fi at the estate went down. My father, Jeffrey, called me 3 times in a row. He didn't leave a voicemail, but I knew exactly what was happening. He didn't know the password. He didn't know the provider. He didn't know that I negotiated the contract every year to keep the high-speed fiber optic running for Courtney's live streams. I didn't answer. 2 days later, the cracks widened. Courtney missed a flight to Tulum for a brand trip. For years, I had been her personal travel agent, tracking her itinerary, checking her in, and arranging the Uber Black to the airport. This time she showed up at the wrong terminal 3 hours late because she couldn't read a 24-hour clock. She left me a voicemail that was 90% screaming and 10% threats to sue me for sabotage. She didn't seem to realize that doing nothing isn't sabotage. It's just reality. Then came the heavy hit. My father missed a dinner with a potential angel investor. I used to sync his calendar, send the confirmation emails, and even prep his briefing notes. Without me, the calendar alert didn't go off. He was sitting in his study drinking scotch, while a man worth $40 million waited at a steakhouse downtown. The voicemails shifted tone. They went from annoyed to frantic to vicious. "You are being selfish," my mother hissed into the phone. "This house is falling apart and you are playing games. Come home and fix this." They didn't miss me. They missed the service. They missed the infrastructure. Watching them spiral from the quiet safety of my studio apartment, I realized something profound about the nature of their lifestyle. I used to think they were powerful. I used to be intimidated by their wealth, their status, the way they walked into a room and commanded attention. But I realized that what I was looking at wasn't power. It was the illusion of power of the empty wallet. In sociology, there is a distinction between being wealthy and performing wealth. My parents were performers. Their status was a cognitive dissonance, a gap between their reality and their self-image that could only be bridged by constant, exhausting maintenance. They didn't own their position in society, they rented it. And the rent was paid in debt, in favors, and in my invisible labor. Their entire lives were a stage set. From the front, it looked like a marble palace. But I was the one backstage holding up the plywood props and taping together the wiring. When you remove the stage manager, the audience finally sees that the castle is made of cardboard. They weren't collapsing because of bad luck. They were collapsing because without someone to constantly curate their reality, the truth of their incompetence was impossible to ignore. They were functionally bankrupt, not just financially, but competently. And for the first time, I wasn't rushing to the stage to tape it back together. I was sitting in the audience watching the show. It took 12 months for the silence to solidify into a wall. In that year, I didn't just survive. I accelerated. I finished my degree a semester early, graduating summa cum laude without a single family member in the audience. By 21, I was working as an operations lead at a fintech startup. I was making 6 figures building a portfolio and finally breathing air that didn't taste like obligation. From a distance, I watched the slow-motion car crash of my former life. The rumors in Buckhead were delicious. Courtney had been blacklisted by 3 major talent agencies for chronic unprofessionalism, which is industry speak for showing up late and hungover. My parents were quietly liquidating assets. First the vacation home in Highlands, then the vintage Porsche. They were selling off the props to keep the stage lights on. I felt a distant clinical pity for them, like watching a nature documentary where the gazelle is too slow. Then came the day I decided to upgrade my life. I found a loft in Midtown, exposed brick floor to ceiling windows, the kind of place that signaled you had arrived. I had the salary. I had the savings. I walked into the leasing office with the confidence of someone who had meticulously engineered her own stability. The leasing agent, a woman who had been smiling warmly at me for 20 minutes, suddenly stopped typing. Her face went slack. She turned the monitor away from me, her voice dropping to a whisper. She said there was a problem with my credit check. She said I was flagged. She said the words, "massive outstanding debt." I didn't argue. I walked out to my car, opened my laptop, and pulled up my full credit report. I expected a mistake, a clerical error. Maybe a medical bill I had missed during the move? What I saw was not an error. It was an execution. There were 4 new accounts opened in the last 11 months. 3 high-limit credit cards and 1 personal loan. The total balance was $280,000. I sat there in the parking lot, the air conditioning humming, and I scrolled through the transaction history. It was a map of Courtney's life. There were charges for the influencer retreat in Tulum that she had posted about. Charges for the wardrobe overhaul she claimed was gifted by brands. A lease down payment on a G-Wagon she said she was test driving for a partnership. The dates lined up perfectly. They started 3 weeks after I left. 3 weeks after I cut off the supply of my labor, they had decided to harvest the supply of my credit. They hadn't just stolen my money. They had stolen my identity to subsidize their delusion. I knew exactly how they justified it. In their minds, this wasn't theft. It was reimbursement. They believed I owed them this. They likely told themselves that raising me, feeding me, and housing me came with a price tag, and since I had resigned from my duties, they were simply collecting the back pay. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a diversified asset class, and they were liquidating me to keep the golden child shining. I closed the laptop. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. A cold, metallic calm settled over me. This was no longer a family dispute. It wasn't about a canceled birthday party or hurt feelings. They had crossed the line from toxic parenting into federal crime. They had bet on my silence. They had bet that I was still the fawn, the fixer, the girl who would swallow poison to keep them warm. They bet wrong. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had saved for emergencies. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call my father. I called a forensic accountant. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Helen, who specialized in family fraud. She was expensive, but I wasn't paying with my parents' money. I was paying with my own. The process was surgical. We compiled the evidence, the credit reports, the unauthorized signatures, the timeline of my departure versus the account openings. Helen drafted the lawsuit. It wasn't just a cease and desist. It was a formal complaint filed in civil court for identity theft, fraud, and emotional distress. We didn't send a warning text, we served them. A process server walked up to the front door of the Buckhead estate on a Tuesday morning, just as my father was leaving for the office. I wasn't there to see it, but I can imagine the scene. The confusion. The denial. The realization that the invisible daughter had just become the most visible threat in their lives. The fallout was immediate and nuclear. My phone exploded, but I didn't answer. I let it ring. I let the voicemails pile up. "Morgan, this is insane," my mother sobbed into the recording. "We were just borrowing it. It's family money. You can't sue your own parents." But I could, and I did. Because the lawsuit was public record, it didn't stay quiet. In Buckhead, gossip travels faster than light. The news that the prominent Jeffrey and Cynthia were being sued by their own daughter for nearly $300,000 in fraud hit the country club circuit like a bomb. Investors pulled out of my father's business, citing instability. The social invitations dried up. They were radioactive. The empire didn't just crumble, it disintegrated. 2 weeks later, my intercom buzzed. The doorman told me my parents were downstairs. I told him to let them up. They looked like ghosts. My father, usually so impeccably dressed, wore a suit that looked like he had slept in it. My mother's face was swollen from crying. They stood in my loft, surrounded by the evidence of my independent success, and they looked small. "Please," my father said, his voice cracking. "Please, drop the lawsuit. We'll lose everything. I could go to jail." I looked at them, really looked at them for the first time in years. I expected to feel anger. I expected to feel triumph. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, the moment they would come crawling back, begging for mercy. But standing there watching them weep in my living room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt nothing. It wasn't hate. It wasn't love. It was a profound, quiet indifference. It was the peace of the scapegoat who has finally walked out of the wilderness. I realized then that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. Hate means you still care. Hate means they still have power over you. Indifference means you are free. "I won't drop the lawsuit," I said. My voice was calm, steady. "But I will offer you a settlement." They looked up, hope flickering in their eyes. You will liquidate the house, I said. You will sell the cars. You will sell the furniture. You will pay off every cent of the debt you took out in my name immediately. You will sign a confession admitting to the fraud so that my credit report is cleared. And you will sign a no-contact order. If you ever try to contact me again for any reason, the deal is void and I will press for criminal charges. My mother sobbed. But where will we live? What about Courtney? That, I said, is not my problem. They signed. They had no choice. 6 months later, I drove past the old house. There was a sold sign in the yard. A moving truck was in the driveway. I watched from a distance as my parents loaded boxes into a rented U-Haul. Courtney was sitting on the curb looking at her phone, probably trying to find someone to blame. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I just kept driving. I am debt-free now. My credit is restored. I have a career I built, a home I pay for, and a circle of friends who love me for who I am, not what I can fix. I don't have parents anymore. I don't have a sister. But I have something better. I have peace. If you've ever had to burn a bridge to save yourself, share this story. And if you're still holding the match, know that peace is waiting on the other side. Thanks for watching.